The bells of St. Bartholomew's in Little Wickham had called the faithful to worship for over 3 centuries, their bronze voices carrying across the village green where autumn mist still clung to the ancient yews. Miss Jane Marple adjusted the modest cluster of violets on her navy hat and made her unhurried way along the cobbled path, her keen blue eyes taking in the small drama that always preceded Sunday service. In her experience, the moments before people presented themselves to the Almighty often revealed the most illuminating aspects of human nature. The September morning held that particular crispness that promised change, and the church itself seemed to whisper with anticipation as parishioners gathered. Mrs. Dolly Bantry swept through the lych gate in her new emerald coat, the aggressive shade suggesting she was still asserting her position as the village's most fashionable widow. Behind her, Dr. Geoffrey Haydock and his wife maintained a careful distance, their hushed conversation indicating either medical emergency or village scandal, both equally probable in Little Wickham. Miss Marple settled into her customary pew 3 rows from the front, positioning herself with the strategic advantage of someone who understood that the best vantage point for observing human behavior was neither too close nor too far from the action. The morning light, filtered through centuries-old stained glass, illuminated the congregation in jeweled patches of color, and she noted the subtle choreography of village relationships with the attention of a naturalist studying bird behavior. Reverend Leonard Clement began the service with his usual grace, though Miss Marple detected a slight tremor in his voice during the opening prayers. Her gaze moved thoughtfully across the congregation, noting the careful positioning of certain individuals. Mr. Alistair Finch, the church warden, whose considerable wealth was matched only by his considerable opinions, sat with unusual stiffness in his front pew, his normally ruddy face pale beneath his thinning hair. His wife Constance, a nervous woman who perpetually fussed about parish duties, kept glancing toward the back of the church where young Lawrence Redding sat with uncharacteristic anxiety, replacing his usual bohemian confidence. Most interesting of all was the triangle of tension between Mrs. Anne Prothero in the family pew, her husband Colonel Lucius Prothero reading his service program with militant determination, and the aforementioned Mr. Redding, whose dark eyes followed Mrs. Prothero's every movement with an intensity that spoke of more than casual acquaintance. The service progressed with familiar rhythms, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with spiritual contemplation. During the gospel reading, she observed Mrs. Prothero's sudden pallor and the way her gloved hands trembled as she gripped her prayer book. When Reverend Clement began his sermon on forgiveness and the dangers of harboring secret resentments, several parishioners shifted uncomfortably, as if his words were aimed at specific hearts rather than offered as general spiritual guidance. It was during the final hymn that the first truly discordant note struck. Mrs. Finch, who should have been collecting hymn books and tidying the church, remained frozen in her pew, her face ashen, her eyes fixed on something near the pulpit that had drained all color from her cheeks. A small, choked gasp escaped her lips, barely audible above the swelling voices of all things bright and beautiful. But to Miss Marple's finely attuned ears, it was a sound of profound distress. As the hymn concluded and the congregation began to stir, Mrs. Finch's trembling finger pointed toward the base of the magnificent oak pulpit. There, slumped in an awkward position that spoke of sudden collapse, lay Mr. Alistair Finch himself. His usually commanding presence had been reduced to a still figure, his spectacles askew, his hand reaching toward something that was no longer there. Dr. Haydock was beside him in moments, his medical training overriding shock as he dropped to examine the fallen man. The church held its collective breath, suspended in disbelief, until the doctor's grim expression and slow shake of his head confirmed what the unnatural stillness had already suggested. "He's gone," Dr. Haydock announced, his voice cutting through the stunned silence, "and I'm afraid this was no natural collapse." The word hung in the hallowed air like incense, heavy, shocking, transformative. The peaceful sanctity of St. Bartholomew's, the quiet assurance of an ordinary Sunday, shattered into fragments as sharp as broken glass. Miss Marple remained seated, her expression outwardly unchanged as she adjusted her spectacles with deliberate calm. Her gaze, however, lingered on details others would miss. The peculiar way Mr. Finch's fingers were curved, as if grasping for something just out of reach, the faint, bitter scent that seemed out of place among the beeswax and lilies, the way certain members of the congregation reacted not with surprise, but with the careful composure of those who had been expecting trouble. Most telling of all was Colonel Poirot's reaction, or rather, his lack thereof. Concerned, yes. Distressed, certainly, but not surprised. His response was that of a man receiving confirmation of feared news rather than shocking revelation. As the initial shock gave way to whispered conversations and nervous glances, Miss Marple sat quietly in her pew, her knitting needles clicking softly in her bag as her mind began to work with the methodical precision that had served her so well in understanding the complexities of human nature. The village of Little Wickham, usually so tranquil in its Sunday rhythms, had just been introduced to something far more sinister than a leaking church roof or disputed flower arrangements. After all, as she had often observed, there was really nothing new under the sun, including murder. And if her long experience had taught her anything, it was that the most shocking crimes often grew from the most ordinary human emotions: jealousy, greed, fear, and the desperate lengths to which people would go to protect their carefully constructed lives. The peaceful Sunday morning had become something else entirely, and Miss Marple settled back to observe, knowing that in the hours to come, the true nature of Little Wickham's residents would be revealed in ways they never intended. The immediate aftermath of Mr. Finch's shocking death transformed St. Bartholomew's from a place of worship into a stage for human drama where the carefully maintained facades of village life began to crack under the pressure of sudden tragedy. Dr. Haydock, his medical training overriding the shock that had frozen most of the congregation, knelt beside the fallen churchwarden with professional efficiency, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands as he confirmed what his initial examination had already suggested. This was no natural death. The bitter almond scent that lingered near the pulpit, barely detectable beneath the church's usual fragrance of beeswax and lilies, spoke of something far more sinister than heart failure or stroke. Reverend Clement, his face pale with distress, managed to stammer instructions for someone to fetch the police, though his voice carried the hollow quality of a man whose sanctuary had been violated in the most profound way possible. Mrs. Constance Finch, supported by the capable arms of Mrs. Dolly Bantry, wept with what appeared to be appropriate grief, yet Miss Marple observed something curious in the widow's demeanour, a tension in her shoulders that suggested relief mingling with sorrow, as if a long-dreaded burden had finally been lifted. The congregation, released from the immediate shock, began to form the inevitable clusters of whispered speculation that always followed village catastrophes, their voices creating a low hum of nervous energy that filled the ancient nave. Colonel Poirot had positioned himself near the church door with military precision, ostensibly to maintain order, but actually, Miss Marple suspected, to control who might enter or leave the scene, his eyes frequently seeking out his wife Anne, who had grown increasingly pale as the reality of the situation settled over them all. Young Lawrence Redding had retreated to the shadows near the back pews, his artistic temperament apparently overwhelmed by the sudden violence, though Miss Marple noted how his agitation seemed to increase whenever Mrs. Poirot's name was mentioned in the hushed conversations around him. When Inspector Slack arrived from much deeping, his broad shoulders and brusque manner immediately commanding attention, he brought with him an air of professional authority that temporarily quelled the more overt speculation, though Miss Marple observed how certain members of the congregation seemed to compose themselves with the careful precision of those who had been expecting trouble. The inspector's preliminary examination, conducted with Dr. Haydock's assistance, confirmed the medical man's initial suspicions about poisoning, a revelation that rippled through the remaining parishioners with the force of a stone dropped into still water. Mrs. Bantry, never one to miss an opportunity for drama, was soon holding court near the war memorial, her voice carrying clearly as she reminded anyone within earshot that poor Alistair had made quite a few enemies with his forceful opinions about parish finances and his tendency to involve himself in matters that others considered none of his business. The speculation grew more pointed as various grievances were resurrected and examined in this new, sinister light. The heated arguments with Colonel Poirot over church renovations, the mysterious telephone calls that had kept Mr. Finch awake nights, according to his widow, and the uncomfortable questions he had been asking about certain financial irregularities that some preferred to leave buried. Miss Marple, moving quietly among the groups with the unnoticed presence of an elderly lady arranging flowers, listened to the various theories with the attention of a naturalist studying bird behavior, noting how quickly people sought to assign blame and how readily they revealed their own biases and resentments in the process. The farmer, Mr. Archer, gruffly suggested that outsiders were to blame, his suspicion falling on anyone not born and bred in Little Wickham, while others whispered about domestic troubles behind closed doors, remembering Mrs. Finch's perpetually nervous demeanor and her husband's reputation for being less than kind in private moments. Most intriguing to Miss Marple was the triangle of tension between the Protheroes and young Redding, whose obvious distress seemed disproportionate to his supposed casual acquaintance with the deceased, particularly when she observed the way his eyes followed Mrs. Protheroe's every movement and how the Colonel's jaw tightened whenever he noticed this attention. As the afternoon wore on and the initial shock began to settle into grim acceptance, the village of Little Wickham found itself transformed from a peaceful community into a collection of potential suspects, each harboring secrets that the morning's tragedy had suddenly made relevant. The poison that had claimed Alistair Finch had done more than end one man's life. It had exposed the hidden currents of resentment, fear, and desperation that flowed beneath the village's tranquil surface, creating a situation that would require more than Inspector Slack's straightforward approach to unravel. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly as she settled into her customary role of observer, knew that the truth would emerge not from forensic evidence alone, but from understanding the complex web of human relationships that had made such a crime not only possible, but perhaps inevitable in the minds of those who had grown desperate enough to contemplate murder in the house of God. Inspector Slack's investigation commenced with the methodical precision of a man who believed that murder cases yielded their secrets through proper procedure and systematic interrogation, though Miss Marple, positioning herself unobtrusively near the church vestry where the interviews were being conducted, suspected that the inspector's confidence in straightforward detection might prove inadequate for the psychological complexities already surfacing in Little Wickham's carefully maintained social fabric. The preliminary examination confirmed Dr. Haydock's initial assessment that Mr. Finch had been poisoned with cyanide, administered during the service itself, a revelation that narrowed the suspect pool to those present in St. Bartholomew's, while creating the disturbing reality that someone among the faithful congregation had committed murder in the most sacred of settings. Mrs. Constance Finch, the first to be questioned in the oak-panelled vestry with its musty scent of ancient prayer books, presented a picture of appropriate, widowly grief punctuated by nervous glances and a tendency to wring her handkerchief with such violence that Miss Marple wondered whether fear might be competing with sorrow for dominance in the woman's emotional state. The widow's account revealed a husband increasingly agitated in recent weeks, receiving mysterious telephone calls at odd hours and expressing unnamed fears about certain individuals who might wish him harm, though she claimed complete ignorance about the specific nature of these concerns, a protestation that struck Miss Marple as suspiciously vague given Mrs. Finch's previously demonstrated intimate knowledge of every detail of parish affairs. Most significantly, Mrs. Finch reluctantly admitted that her husband had recently revised his will, a document changed just the week before his death, to to significantly increase her inheritance while reducing substantial bequests previously promised to various village organizations, introducing a financial motive that Inspector Slack seized upon with obvious satisfaction. Colonel Poirot proved a more challenging interview subject, his military bearing and clipped responses suggesting a man more accustomed to giving orders than answering questions, though Miss Marple detected underlying tension that transcended natural concern about a fellow parishioner's death. The colonel acknowledged recent disagreements with the deceased about church finances, characterizing them as honest differences of opinion rather than personal animosity. But his careful word choices and avoidance of direct eye contact when discussing these disputes suggested conflicts more heated than he was willing to admit. Most revealing was the colonel's reaction when Inspector Slack mentioned Lawrence Redding, a subtle tightening around his eyes that spoke of more than casual disapproval, particularly regarding the artist's frequent visits to the Poirot household and his growing friendship with Mrs. Anne Poirot, a relationship the colonel dismissed as harmless while displaying obvious discomfort. Mrs. Anne Poirot herself presented a steady and barely controlled emotion, her pale beauty marred by dark circles and nervous mannerisms suggesting sleepless nights and hidden anxieties predating the morning's tragedy. Her interview revealed a woman caught between loyalty to her husband and some unnamed burden that made her reluctant to meet Inspector Slack's direct questions with equally direct answers, particularly when conversation turned to her relationship with the deceased and any knowledge of his recent concerns. Mrs. Poirot's account of noticing Mr. Finch's apparent distress during recent weeks aligned with other testimony, but her descriptions carried a more personal quality, as if she had observed him more closely than casual acquaintance would suggest, leading Miss Marple to wonder about the true nature of their relationship and whether the church warden's fears might have connected to secrets involving the colonel's wife. The most intriguing aspect of Mrs. Poirot's testimony was her mention of receiving an anonymous letter the previous week, a missive that had apparently upset her greatly, though she claimed to have destroyed it immediately and refused to reveal its contents, insisting it bore no relevance to current events, while displaying the kind of agitation that suggested exactly the opposite. Lawrence Redding's interview concluded the afternoon's formal questioning, his artistic temperament and obvious emotional distress making him appear either genuinely shocked by the tragedy or skillfully performing innocence. Though Miss Marple noted how his distress seemed focused more on Mrs. Poirot's well-being than on the death itself, a priority suggesting deeper feelings than he was willing to acknowledge publicly. Throughout these proceedings, Miss Marple observed the subtle interplay of village relationships with the attention of a naturalist studying complex ecosystem dynamics, noting how each revelation shifted the delicate balance of suspicion and how quickly long-buried grievances surfaced when murder provided justification for their examination, while her knitting needles clicked softly as her mind began organizing the human elements of this puzzle with the same methodical care she applied to her most intricate patterns. By Monday morning, Inspector Slack had constructed what he considered a compelling case against Lawrence Redding, built upon the solid foundation of motive, means, and opportunity that satisfied his preference for straightforward detection over the psychological complexities that Miss Marple found increasingly significant in understanding the true dynamics surrounding Mr. Finch's death. The evidence against the young artist appeared damning when, assembled systematically, his well-documented romantic attachment to Mrs. Poirot provided clear motive for eliminating a man who had recently begun making pointed inquiries about improper relationships within the parish, while his precarious financial situation and mounting debts suggested desperation sufficient to drive a man to extreme measures. Most compelling was the discovery that Redding had purchased prussic acid from the village chemist just 3 days before the murder, ostensibly for photographic developing purposes, though the quantity far exceeded any reasonable artistic requirement, and his explanation seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous when pressed for details. Inspector Slack's theory centered on Redding's opportunity to poison Mr. Finch during the confusion of the morning service, a scenario requiring careful timing, but certainly possible for someone familiar with the church's layout and the predictable rhythms of Sunday worship, particularly given the artist's habit of arriving early to help with preparations and his access to areas normally restricted to ordinary parishioners. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager to contribute despite the inspector's obvious preference for professional procedure over village gossip, provided testimony about observing Redding in animated conversation with Mr. Finch outside the church several weeks earlier, a discussion that appeared heated despite their attempts to maintain discretion, though she admitted her hearing was not what it once was, and she could not swear to the exact nature of their disagreement. The case seemed to crystallize further when Dr. Haydock reluctantly confirmed that the amount of cyanide required could easily have been concealed in a small container and administered without detection, particularly if the perpetrator possessed knowledge of the victim's habits and timing, information that Redding certainly had given his regular attendance and growing involvement in parish activities. However, Miss Marple found herself increasingly skeptical of this neat solution as she observed other village residents' reactions to the mounting evidence against Redding, noting how certain individuals displayed relief rather than surprise, as if the young artist's guilt provided convenient cover for secrets they preferred to keep buried, while others seemed genuinely shocked in ways suggesting they possessed information about the true circumstances that had not yet been revealed. Most troubling was Mrs. Prothero's reaction to her supposed lover's predicament, a response combining appropriate distress with an underlying current of guilt, as if she blamed herself for circumstances leading to this tragedy rather than simply grieving for an innocent man wrongly accused of murder. Colonel Prothero's behavior proved equally illuminating, his satisfaction at Redding's removal from the scene tempered by nervous energy, suggesting unfinished business rather than the relief of a man whose marital concerns had been resolved through elimination of his wife's admirer, leading Miss Marple to wonder whether the Colonel's motivations might be more complex than simple jealousy. Even Mrs. Finch's reaction struck Miss Marple as oddly muted, her relief at having the mystery apparently solved, competing with anxiety that seemed to increase rather than decrease as Inspector Slack's investigation appeared to reach its conclusion, suggesting the widow possessed knowledge about her husband's death extending beyond what she had revealed in formal testimony. During her afternoon visit to St. Bartholomew's, ostensibly to arrange flowers for the memorial service, Miss Marple made a discovery that would prove significant to her understanding of the crime's true nature, finding beneath the pulpit runner a tiny shard of brown glass that carried the faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds when warmed between careful fingers. The fragment suggested that a container had been broken during or immediately after the murder, then hastily concealed, raising questions about what had happened to the missing pieces and who had possessed both the presence of mind and the opportunity to dispose of incriminating evidence while maintaining an appearance of shocked innocence before the gathered congregation. The following morning brought Miss Marple's quiet investigation into areas that Inspector Slack's procedural approach had overlooked, revealing complexities in Mr. Finch's final weeks that painted a picture extending far beyond the romantic triangle that had captured official attention and suggested motives rooted in financial rather than emotional desperation. Her visit to Mrs. Finch, ostensibly to offer comfort and assistance with funeral arrangements, provided insights into the deceased's recent behavior that indicated a man increasingly consumed by fears transcending simple concern about improper relationships within his parish, though the widow's carefully guarded responses suggested knowledge she was reluctant to share, even with someone as seemingly harmless as an elderly neighbor offering sympathy. The conversation revealed that Mr. Finch had been conducting what his wife described as private investigations into various parish matters, spending long hours reviewing financial records and making discreet inquiries about certain individuals' backgrounds, activities that had generated an increasing number of threatening telephone calls and anonymous letters warning him to abandon his pursuits before serious consequences ensued. Most significantly, Mrs. Finch reluctantly admitted that her husband had discovered what he termed irregularities in the Church Restoration Fund, discrepancies that had prompted him to schedule a meeting with church officials for the Monday following his death. A meeting intended to expose what he believed was systematic embezzlement of funds designated for sacred purposes. This revelation cast the murder in an entirely different light, suggesting that financial rather than romantic motives might have driven someone to eliminate a man whose investigations threatened to expose criminal activity. Though Mrs. Finch insisted she knew nothing about the specific nature of her husband's discoveries or the identity of those he suspected of wrongdoing. Miss Marple's subsequent examination of the church records, conducted while helping Reverend Clement organize memorial arrangements, revealed patterns of expenditure and authorization that struck her experienced eye as suspicious, particularly regarding certain large payments to contractors whose work seemed inadequately documented and whose credentials appeared questionable upon closer scrutiny. Most revealing was her discovery of a hidden compartment in Mr. Finch's church warden desk, containing copies of correspondence and financial documents that painted a damning picture of systematic fraud involving inflated contracts, phantom expenses, and carefully concealed transfers of church funds to private accounts, evidence that would have destroyed several reputations and likely resulted in criminal charges had the church warden lived to present his findings to proper authorities. The documents implicated not only obvious suspects with access to church finances, but revealed a network of complicity extending to several prominent village residents, including individuals whose public positions and social standing would have made exposure particularly devastating, providing multiple motives for murder that transcended the simple romantic triangle that had captured Inspector Slack's attention, and suggested that Mr. Finch's death represented not elimination of a romantic rival, but the desperate act of someone whose criminal activities had been discovered and who faced ruin if the church warden's investigations became public knowledge. Miss Marple understood that Inspector Slack's confidence in Lawrence Redding's guilt, while satisfying the requirements of straightforward detection, overlooked the psychological complexities that her long experience with human nature suggested were far more significant than romantic jealousy in explaining Mr. Finch's death, leading her to pursue her own quiet investigation through the social channels that had always proved more revealing than official interrogation. Her first stop was tea with Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose encyclopedic knowledge of village finances and personal relationships had been cultivated through decades of careful observation disguised as innocent gossip, and who proved eager to discuss the various individuals involved in the church restoration project with the kind of detailed analysis that only comes from genuine concern, mixed with natural curiosity, about one's neighbor's affairs. From Dolly, she learned that Mrs. Sylvia Pierce, the formidable chairwoman of the Restoration Committee, had been conducting unusually frequent consultations with Mr. Owen Hargreaves, the builder from Much Deeping, whose elaborate invoices had raised eyebrows among those parishioners who understood construction costs, while Mr. Edwin Larch, the former bank clerk who maintained the parish ledgers with obsessive precision, had recently begun locking the vestry safe at irregular hours and displaying obvious discomfort whenever large expenditures were mentioned in committee meetings. Armed with this information, Miss Marple made her way to the village chemist under the pretext of purchasing lavender salts for a faintness she did not feel, engaging Mr. Hopkins in seemingly casual conversation about bottles and their various properties, a discussion that yielded the crucial information that prussic acid was dispensed exclusively in ribbed cobalt blue glass containers with distinctive skull labels, never in the thin brown glass that would shatter into the kind of crescents she had discovered beneath the pulpit. Most intriguingly, Mr. Hopkins recalled receiving a telephone inquiry from a woman asking whether laurel leaves, when properly steeped, would produce the same bitter almond scent as prussic acid, a question that had struck him as odd at the time, though he could not recall the exact date or identify the caller's voice with certainty. This revelation led Miss Marple to consider the extensive laurel hedge that bordered both the vicarage garden and Colonel Protheroe's property, where she had previously noticed jam jars inverted over wasp holes, suggesting someone with access to both properties and knowledge of natural poisons that might serve as either genuine murder weapons or clever misdirection designed to confuse the investigation. Her visit to the vicarage, ostensibly to deliver beef broth to the overworked Reverend Clement, provided additional insights into the church's administrative structure and the distribution of keys that would have allowed access to areas where poison might be concealed or administered. While the vicar's reluctant admission that Mr. Finch had spoken of approaching magistrates about financial irregularities confirmed her growing suspicion that the murder was connected to the Restoration Fund fraud rather than romantic entanglements. The most revealing conversation occurred during her afternoon call on Mrs. Anne Protheroe, where a small jar of gooseberry jam and the kind of patient silence that only experienced listeners can maintain eventually unlocked the secret of the anonymous letter that had caused such distress the previous week, a missive threatening to drag Anne's name through public scandal if she did not persuade her husband to abandon his support for Mr. Finch's financial investigations. The letter's postscript, mentioning both the pulpit and Sunday service, explained Anne's visible dread during the morning worship and suggested that someone had been planning the murder well in advance while using her fear as additional psychological pressure to ensure the investigation would be terminated before damaging revelations could emerge. Miss Marple's examination of the brown glass fragment, when combined with Mr. Hopkins' testimony about proper poison containers, suggested that the actual murder weapon had been hastily improvised from materials at hand rather than carefully planned using Redding's purchased prussic acid, indicating either desperation or the kind of opportunistic thinking that characterized someone accustomed to manipulating circumstances for personal advantage. Her observation of various suspects' behavior revealed patterns more consistent with financial terror than romantic jealousy, particularly Mr. Larch's nervous reaction when she mentioned Mr. Finch's interest in papers and documents, combined with the telltale ink stains on his cuff that suggested recent forgery work using different materials than those normally employed in official church records. The complexity of the emerging picture convinced Miss Marple that the true murderer possessed both the intelligence to orchestrate sophisticated financial fraud and the ruthless pragmatism necessary to eliminate threats through carefully calculated violence, though she suspected that the perpetrator's confidence in their ability to control circumstances and manipulate official investigations might ultimately provide the psychological leverage necessary to expose their guilt through the kind of subtle pressure that had served her so well in previous encounters with criminal minds that believed themselves superior to both law enforcement and village gossip. The discovery that would shift Miss Marple's understanding of the entire affair came not through dramatic revelation, but through the kind of small, seemingly insignificant detail that others might dismiss as coincidence, beginning when Mrs. Higgins, the vicarage housekeeper whose devotion to cleanliness bordered on the evangelical, mentioned during their Tuesday morning conversation about memorial arrangements that she had found the most peculiar thing while tidying the small storage room where Lawrence Redding occasionally kept his painting supplies. The item in question was a crumpled piece of paper, stained with what appeared to be ink and bearing what looked remarkably like the young artist's distinctive handwriting, though Mrs. Higgins confessed she had hesitated to examine it closely since it seemed to contain personal thoughts of a rather distressing nature, and she had always been taught that reading another person's private correspondence was the height of impropriety. Miss Marple, her curiosity aroused by the housekeeper's obvious discomfort and the suspicious timing of such a discovery, gently persuaded Mrs. Higgins to retrieve the document for proper examination, and what she read confirmed her growing suspicion that the true perpetrator of Mr. Finch's murder was far more cunning than Inspector Slack's straightforward investigation had anticipated. The paper contained what appeared to be a confession written in Lawrence Redding's hand, admitting to the murder of Mr. Finch and describing the crime in terms that aligned perfectly with the evidence Inspector Slack had assembled. Yet Miss Marple's experienced eye immediately detected subtle inconsistencies that suggested careful forgery rather than genuine remorse, particularly in the formation of certain letters and the overly dramatic language that seemed designed to convince rather than confess. Most telling was the document's placement in a location where discovery was inevitable, yet not immediate, suggesting someone who wanted the confession found at precisely the right moment to deflect suspicion while appearing to solve the case conclusively, a strategy that required intimate knowledge of both the investigation's progress and Redding's habits and access to church property. The confession's content, while addressing the known facts of the case, conspicuously avoided any mention of the financial irregularities that Miss Marple knew had been consuming Mr. Finch's attention in his final weeks. An omission that struck her as significant since a truly guilty, Redding would likely have referenced the church warden's investigations as additional motivation for his desperate act, while someone seeking to misdirect attention from financial crimes would naturally avoid drawing attention to that particular aspect of the victim's recent activities. Her examination of the paper itself revealed traces of the kind of high-quality ink used in official documents rather than the cheaper variety typically employed by struggling artists, while the careful creasing suggested deliberate aging rather than natural wear from being carried in a pocket or hidden hastily after composition, details that reinforced her growing conviction that the confession represented sophisticated misdirection rather than genuine evidence. The psychological profile suggested by the confession also struck Miss Marple as inconsistent with her observations of Lawrence Redding's character, particularly the emphasis on jealous rage over romantic rivalry, when her conversations with him had revealed a man more concerned with Mrs. Prothero's welfare than possessive of her affections, while the document's tone suggested someone attempting to mimic emotional distress rather than expressing genuine remorse for a terrible act committed in passion. Most significantly, the timing of the confession's discovery coincided suspiciously with increasing pressure on the church's financial records, as Reverend Clement had mentioned that Inspector Slack was beginning to show interest in the Restoration Fund accounts following Miss Marple's gentle suggestions about examining all aspects of Mr. Finch's recent concerns, creating circumstances where someone with access to those records might feel compelled to provide alternative explanations for the murder before financial investigations revealed uncomfortable truths. Miss Marple's careful inquiry into who might have had opportunity to plant the confession revealed that several individuals possessed keys to the vicarage storage areas, including church officials responsible for maintaining supplies and records, while her observation of various suspects' reactions to news of the document's discovery provided additional insights into their psychological states, particularly noting how certain individuals displayed relief rather than surprise, as if a carefully orchestrated plan was proceeding according to expectations. The most revealing reaction came from Mr. Edwin Larch, whose response to learning about the confession combined appropriate concern with an underlying satisfaction that suggested personal investment in the document's credibility, while his casual mention of having noticed Redding's increasingly erratic behavior in recent weeks provided testimony that seemed too convenient and well-prepared for spontaneous observation, raising questions about whether such observations were genuine or carefully constructed to support a predetermined narrative designed to eliminate suspicion from other quarters. The evening mist that settled over Little Wickham on Thursday carried with it an air of expectation that Miss Marple recognized from long experience with human nature under pressure, the kind of atmospheric tension that preceded either confession or desperate action from individuals whose carefully constructed deceptions had begun to crumble under scrutiny. Her morning visit to the church, ostensibly to arrange flowers for the upcoming memorial service, had yielded the discovery she had been expecting: traces of the same bitter almond scent near the vestry safe where the financial records were kept, confirming her suspicion that the murder weapon had been prepared and concealed within the church itself, rather than brought from outside by someone unfamiliar with the building's layout and routines. The afternoon brought news that would shift the entire investigation when Mrs. Higgins, arriving early to prepare for evening choir practice, discovered smoke seeping from beneath the vestry door and raised the alarm that brought half the village running with buckets and determined expressions that spoke of communities accustomed to fighting their own battles against disaster. The fire, when finally contained by the combined efforts of villagers and the volunteer brigade from Much Deeping, had consumed several boxes of old parish records and damaged the oak table where the current ledgers were normally stored. Though curiously, the flames seemed to have been most destructive to documents from recent years, while leaving older records relatively untouched, a pattern that struck Miss Marple as suspiciously selective for what should have been random destruction. Most significant was the discovery of Edwin Larch, unconscious near the vestry entrance, a gash on his forehead suggesting he had been struck while attempting to save church property. Though Miss Marple noted several inconsistencies in the scene that troubled her experienced eye, the wound's clean edges suggested contact with a smooth surface rather than a weapon. The positioning of his body indicated he had fallen toward the door rather than away from an attacker, and most tellingly, his clothes bore traces of paraffin that seemed inconsistent with someone who had been fighting flames rather than setting them. When Larch regained consciousness and provided his account of surprising an intruder who had struck him down while attempting to destroy evidence, Inspector Slack seized upon this development as confirmation that someone was desperately trying to eliminate traces of their guilt, though he remained focused on Lawrence Redding, despite the obvious problems with that theory, given the artist's documented presence at the King's Arms during the relevant time period. The rescued documents that Larch claimed to have saved from the flames told a different story than his heroic narrative suggested, revealing what appeared to be systematic alterations to recent entries that would have shifted financial responsibility from church officials to outside contractors, though the modifications were so skillfully executed that only someone with intimate knowledge of proper bookkeeping procedures would have detected the subtle changes in ink color and handwriting pressure that indicated recent tampering. Miss Marple's examination of the scene, conducted while offering tea and sympathy to the shaken participants, revealed additional details that reinforced her growing certainty about the true perpetrator's identity. The fire had been set using materials readily available within the church rather than brought from outside. The pattern of destruction suggested someone familiar with which records contained the most damaging information, and most significantly, the timing coincided perfectly with increased pressure from Inspector Slack's investigation into the financial irregularities that Mr. Finch had been pursuing before his death. During the evening's informal gathering at the vicarage, where concerned parishioners discussed security measures and the implications of the attack, Miss Marple observed the subtle dynamics between various suspects with the attention of a naturalist studying complex social behaviors, noting how Larch's account of his heroic actions grew more detailed and dramatic with each retelling, while his explanations for certain inconsistencies became increasingly elaborate and defensive when questioned by those with practical experience of fires and their effects. The most revealing moment came when Dr. Haydock, examining Larch's wound with professional thoroughness, commented that the injury pattern suggested contact with a sharp corner rather than a blow from a weapon, an observation that caused visible discomfort in the patient and prompted increasingly agitated explanations about the confusion and darkness that had made precise recollection difficult, responses that struck Miss Marple as the reactions of someone whose carefully rehearsed story was being undermined by inconvenient medical evidence. Her decision to test her suspicions came during a quiet moment when she approached Larch with apparent concern about his welfare and gentle questions about his recollections of the evening's events, using the kind of sympathetic inquiry that encouraged confidences while actually probing for inconsistencies in his narrative, particularly regarding his knowledge of which documents had been in the vestry and why he had been in that area of the church at such an unusual hour when choir practice was scheduled for the main sanctuary. The psychological pressure of her seemingly innocent questions, combined with the stress of maintaining his deception while recovering from his self-inflicted injury, began to show in Larch's increasingly nervous responses and his tendency to provide information about the fire's effects that he should not have possessed if his account of being unconscious during the crucial period was accurate. Revelations that confirmed Miss Marple's growing conviction that the fire had been a desperate attempt to destroy evidence of financial fraud rather than eliminate traces of murder. Though the arsonist's miscalculation had been assuming that physical destruction of records would be sufficient to end an investigation that had already uncovered the essential patterns of embezzlement and misdirection that had motivated the original crime. The morning following the vestry fire found Miss Marple arranging what she described to Reverend Clement as a small gathering to discuss memorial arrangements and the salvaging of parish records, though her true purpose involved applying the kind of gentle psychological pressure that had served her so well in previous encounters with criminal minds who believed themselves superior to both official investigation and village scrutiny. She had invited precisely those individuals whose reactions would prove most illuminating when confronted with carefully selected evidence presented in the seemingly innocent context of community concern, creating circumstances where guilty knowledge might betray itself through the kind of involuntary responses that no amount of careful preparation could entirely suppress. Edwin Larch arrived at the vicarage appearing appropriately subdued by his ordeal, his bandaged head and careful movements suggesting a man still recovering from his heroic efforts to save church property. Though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands and the way his eyes avoided direct contact when discussing the previous evening's events, reactions suggesting anxiety extending beyond simple physical discomfort. Mrs. Pierce and Mr. Hargreaves completed the gathering, their presence providing both witnesses and additional pressure points, while Inspector Slack positioned himself near the hearth with barely concealed impatience, eager to proceed with arrests once evidence aligned with his investigative instincts, though Miss Marple suspected the inspector's straightforward approach would prove inadequate for the psychological complexities she intended to explore. The conversation began innocuously enough, with expressions of gratitude for Larch's bravery and concern about the damage to historical records, though Miss Marple soon guided the discussion toward the fortunate habit of making copies for important documents, a practice she characterized as increasingly common among careful administrators who understood the value of preserving sensitive information against unforeseen circumstances. Her casual mention of photostated pages safely stored with Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, caused the first visible crack in Larch's composure, a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested recognition of a threat he had not anticipated, particularly when she referenced specific entries from the restoration accounts with details that should have been destroyed in the fire, but apparently survived through Mr. Finch's cautious duplication of suspicious transactions. The psychological pressure intensified when Miss Marple produced the brown glass fragment she had discovered beneath the pulpit, presenting it not as evidence but as a curious anomaly that reminded her of household bottles used for various domestic purposes, including the preparation of natural extracts from garden plants like cherry laurel, whose bitter almond scent might linger for days on containers and clothing, observations that caused Larch to glance reflexively at his cuff, where traces of glass might still cling to fabric fibers. Her seemingly innocent questions about key distribution and access procedures revealed Larch's deeper involvement in church administration than his modest position would normally justify, particularly his recent redistribution of duplicate keys for what he termed efficiency, but which suggested someone positioning himself for unauthorized access to sensitive areas during unusual hours. The mention of anonymous letters and their typical paper sources prompted another involuntary correction when Miss Marple deliberately misstated a watermark detail, causing Larch to provide information about church stationery that demonstrated intimate familiarity with materials used for official correspondence, knowledge that extended beyond his legitimate duties, and suggested involvement in the threatening communications that had terrorized Mrs. Prothero before the murder. Most damaging was Miss Marple's gentle discussion of bookkeeping irregularities, presented as abstract observations about the challenges of maintaining accurate records when dealing with multiple contractors and complex transactions, though her specific references to duplicated entries, altered ink tones, and suspicious credit transfers clearly describe techniques that only someone with advanced accounting skills and detailed knowledge of the church's financial systems could have executed with sufficient sophistication to deceive casual inspection. The psychological breaking point came when Miss Marple mentioned Mr. Finch's habit of maintaining private copies of sensitive documents in locations outside the church, a precaution that would have preserved evidence of financial irregularities even if official records were destroyed. Information that struck Larch with the force of a physical blow and prompted increasingly agitated denials about the existence of such materials. His protests grew more desperate and specific as Miss Marple continued her gentle probing, revealing knowledge about the investigation's scope and the evidence's nature that he could only have possessed through direct involvement in both the embezzlement scheme and the subsequent murder designed to prevent its exposure, while his references to the fire's thoroughness in destroying incriminating materials demonstrated awareness of what specific documents had been targeted for destruction. The final revelation came through Larch's own words as panic overcame caution, his desperate insistence that Mr. Finch had possessed no real proof, transforming into angry admissions about the systematic fraud he had orchestrated, the financial pressures that had driven him to increasingly desperate measures, and the terrible calculation that had led him to poison a man whose Christian charity had offered him the opportunity for confession and restitution rather than immediate exposure and prosecution. Miss Marple listened to this self-incrimination with the composed attention she might give to a confession in church, her gentle questions having achieved their purpose of exposing not only the technical details of embezzlement and murder, but the psychological profile of a man whose outward respectability had concealed years of systematic deception, betrayal of trust, and ultimately the kind of moral bankruptcy that could contemplate murder as a solution to problems of his own creation, while Inspector Slack prepared to make the arrest that would finally bring justice to Little Wickham and peace to the memory of Alistair Finch. The final confrontation unfolded in the familiar comfort of the vicarage drawing-room, where Miss Marple had arranged what she termed a small gathering to discuss the unfortunate events that had so disrupted Little Wickham's peaceful routine, though Inspector Slack's presence and the careful positioning of chairs suggested something far more significant than a social call, while Edwin Larch arrived with his bandaged head and the careful movements of a man still recovering from his heroic efforts to save church property, his modest demeanor intact despite the subtle tension that Miss Marple's gentle invitation had created. She began, as was her custom, with seemingly innocent observations about human nature and the curious ways people respond to pressure, noting how Mr. Finch had developed the habit in recent weeks of carrying a small brown bottle of nerve drops, a detail his widow confirmed with nervous precision while adding that the bottle had mysteriously vanished after his death, an absence that had troubled her without her understanding why, until Miss Marple produced the tiny shard of brown glass she had discovered beneath the pulpit runner, its faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds revealing the true murder weapon. The revelation that prussic acid was never dispensed in brown glass, but only in distinctive cobalt blue containers, immediately eliminated Lawrence Redding's purchase as the source of poison. While Miss Marple's gentle discussion of household remedies and the properties of cherry laurel leaves led naturally to observations about the extensive laurel hedges bordering both the vicarage and various parish properties, accessible to anyone with proper keys and sufficient botanical knowledge to prepare what country housekeepers once knew as a deadly extract. Her patient reconstruction revealed how the poison had been administered through substitution, replacing Mr. Finch's familiar nerve drops with the fatal preparation, a method requiring intimate knowledge of his habits and access to his personal effects during the vulnerable moments of Sunday service when anxiety about his planned Monday revelations would drive him to seek the comfort of his accustomed remedy. The forged confession, allegedly written by Redding, crumbled under Miss Marple's gentle analysis, its too-perfect handwriting betraying the careful copying of someone familiar with official documents rather than the natural flow of genuine emotion, while its conspicuous omission of any financial motive revealed an author more concerned with misdirection than complete confession, particularly when combined with the high-quality ink more suited to parish records than an impoverished artist's supplies. Most damning was the vestry fire, which Larch's own words had revealed to be suspiciously selective in its destruction, consuming recent financial records while leaving older documents mysteriously intact, a pattern suggesting guidance by someone intimately familiar with which materials contained the most incriminating evidence, while his self-inflicted injury bore the clean edges of contact with furniture rather than the irregular wounds expected from genuine assault by an unknown intruder. Under the mounting pressure of Miss Marple's seemingly innocent questions about access, opportunity, and the curious coincidences that had shaped recent events, Larch's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, his desperate protests about the thoroughness of the fire's destruction revealing knowledge he could only have possessed through direct involvement, while his increasingly specific denials about evidence that should have been completely destroyed betrayed awareness of exactly what materials Mr. Finch had been investigating before his death. The complete confession that followed revealed years of systematic embezzlement, beginning with minor adjustments to petty cash and expanding into sophisticated fraud involving inflated contractor invoices and fictitious expenses, a scheme that had required increasingly complex manipulations to conceal the growing shortfall in church funds, until Mr. Finch's methodical investigation had uncovered the pattern of irregularities and threatened to expose not only the financial crimes, but the network of collusion that had made them possible. As Inspector Slack moved forward to make the arrest that would finally bring justice to Little Wickham, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony that Edwin Larch's crimes had grown from relatively minor financial difficulties that honest confession might have resolved into a pattern of deception culminating in the calculated murder of a man whose only fault had been excessive diligence in protecting the community's resources, while the psychological profile revealed through his breakdown showed how outward respectability could conceal fundamental moral weakness that allowed financial pressure to overcome ethical constraints, transforming a trusted parish official into someone capable of exploiting Christian charity for personal gain and ultimately repaying genuine concern with betrayal and murder in the house of God itself. The arrest of Edwin Larch sent shockwaves through Little Wickham that reverberated far beyond the immediate circle of those present at the vicarage, transforming the quiet village's understanding of itself and forcing every resident to confront the uncomfortable reality that systematic deception and calculated murder had flourished beneath their trusting noses for years, while Miss Marple observed with characteristic composure how quickly human nature sought to reconcile the monstrous revelation with their previous assumptions about community safety and moral certainty. Mrs. Constance Finch faced the most complex emotional journey. Her grief for a husband whose death had initially seemed like divine punishment for his suspicious nature, now transformed into profound sorrow for a good man whose only fault had been excessive diligence in protecting church resources, while the financial security provided by his revised will carried the bitter taste of blood money that would require careful stewardship under Reverend Clement's guidance to transform into something resembling honest inheritance rather than the proceeds of tragedy. Lawrence Redding's complete exoneration brought relief tempered by the psychological scars of having been considered capable of murder, his artistic sensitivity bruised by the harsh realities of criminal suspicion and the terrible knowledge that his romantic feelings for Mrs. Prothero had nearly cost him his freedom, though his reunion with her provided the village with its first genuinely hopeful development since the tragedy began. Their engagement announced with quiet dignity that acknowledged lessons learned about the dangers of concealing honest emotions behind social propriety. Colonel Prothero's response to his wife's newfound happiness revealed depths of character that surprised those who had dismissed him as merely rigid military authority. his gracious acceptance of divorce proceedings and generous settlement demonstrating nobility that emerges when individuals choose honor over wounded pride. While his decision to relocate to Devon provided both couples with geographical distance necessary for healing and new beginnings free from the shadows of recent events. The financial investigation that followed Larch's confession revealed the full scope of his systematic embezzlement. Nearly £3,000 diverted from church funds through increasingly sophisticated manipulations over 5 years, while recovery efforts led by hastily assembled volunteers worked to restore the fire-damaged vestry and implement oversight procedures designed to prevent future abuse of trust, including mandatory dual signatures for expenditures and quarterly reviews by independent auditors from Much Deeping. Inspector Slack's professional reputation survived the case's complexities largely through Miss Marple's diplomatic handling of credit for the solution. Her gentle insistence that official procedures had ultimately prevailed, allowing the inspector to maintain dignity while privately acknowledging the value of psychological insight over purely procedural methods, particularly when dealing with crimes rooted in long-term deception rather than crimes of passion. Reverend Clement struggled most profoundly with the spiritual implications of betrayal within his church's very walls, his sermons taking on new urgency as he addressed the pervasive nature of sin even in outwardly virtuous communities, while the memorial service for Alastair Finch, 3 weeks after his death, provided the community's first opportunity to gather in St. Bartholomew's without unresolved mystery. Though the occasion carried bittersweet undertones as parishioners reflected on the price of vigilance and the tragic irony of a man's dedication costing him his life. Miss Marple's reflections on the case, shared during quiet conversations with Mrs. Bantry over afternoon tea, emphasized her recurring observation that shocking crimes often grew from ordinary human weaknesses, financial pressure transforming into desperation, small deceptions expanding into systematic fraud, and ultimately the terrible calculation that murder might solve problems. Honest confession could have addressed with far less devastating consequences, while she noted with satisfaction that the community's fundamental character remained intact despite revelations about Larch's crimes. The village's gradual return to normal rhythms included inevitable gossip and speculation that would continue for months, though new friendships formed between individuals who had supported each other through crisis, demonstrating positive aspects of human nature that balanced darker impulses revealed by investigation, while practical changes like transparent financial reporting and expanded oversight created safeguards that would influence parish governance for years to come. As autumn deepened into winter and immediate shock faded into memory, Little Wickham began rebuilding trust and moving forward, the Restoration Fund rehabilitated through restitution from Larch's seized assets and community contributions, while St. Bartholomew's itself stood a symbol of resilience despite walls that now held memories of betrayal, alongside centuries of faithful worship. The ancient stones bearing witness to humanity's capacity for both profound evil and remarkable recovery from moral devastation.